is something that you want to be able to bring in and not wait until maybe a month or two until the next release of Wazuh. Okay, so even though we have a very active, threat intelligence team adding in rules into each new version of Wazuh, it is on the works something that is more immediate. In the meantime, we do try to make write-ups of new threats that are coming up. So, for example, if we go here, cobalt strikes are more of a testing tool. But yeah, scrolling down a little bit, here we got Pandora, which is also not recent. But yeah, when I remember specifically, Lock4Shell, Spring4Shell, SysJoker came out. All of those, we made a little idea on how to work on this. So the blog is quite interesting. And we are trying to be a lot more active, because if you followed this maybe a year ago, you would see that we would post maybe once or twice every couple of months. Okay. So, Rick, questions on CDB lists. So, right, let's see. I have the chat, 2 new messages. Oh yeah, should have used less instead of then. Yes. I know. So it was intentional. I also wanted to show, I intentionally wanted to show something slow. But yeah, if you go with less, less is more. You can go through it quite nicely. Also, if you do things like head or tail, luckily that works quite well as well. So that's nice. I found some time that there is the tailf that I thought before was just an alias of this, but no, when you're working with very large files, tailf, it's not even installed on here. That doesn't perform as well. So if you ever need to follow a file that is already very large, tail-f is your tool. Cool. So yeah, with the feed, it's also something. It's going to be also having an impact on the way that we work. We are, Wazuh is a services company. It is something that is intended to be made on an early release cycle for cloud users and support users, and then to the public. But the details are still not set in stone since it hasn't been released yet. But yeah, I'm really looking forward to that type of threat intelligence, which will include things like CDB lists, which is part of the rule set. It will also include rules decoders, and very interestingly, SCA policies, security configuration assessment policies, which we'll get to shortly. Okay, so cool. You've all done this. Let's talk about active responses. And active responses is another thing that I see a lot of people doing. It is a very powerful tool. But it is also a very powerful tool, and as such, with great power comes great responsibility. So first of all, I'm not sure. I think I had a note to change the order on this ones, because so active response is basically an automated action that is going to be taken when a rule or a set of rules is triggered. Okay. So, and this is something that can be run on the endpoints being monitored or in the manager that acts itself as an endpoint being monitored. Okay, these are configured on the manager, and on the agents you can enable or disable them, and you can add more, because something that is going to be very important is that we are still following the restriction that the manager is not allowed to run arbitrary code on the endpoint, right? So it will only allow the manager to tell it to run things that are already been placed beforehand on the agent's active response directory, right? Which in the case of Linux, you'll see that out of the box has several files, 15 in this case. On Windows, it only has 3 of them. And it's like 2 of them to block IPs and 1 more to add. Okay. And so if you want active responses to work, you do not need to enable remote commands, but you need to place the file within here. The executable must be inside of this folder, and the Wazuh manager does not have the ability to send things into this folder, right? We can use centralized configuration, to send things into var OSSEC, etc. shared, right, on the agents. However, if you want to give the manager the ability to push out configurations into or push out new responses into this folder, well, one way I've seen people doing is creating another active response, adding them all to the agents, so that it will sort of synchronize, you know, the shared active response group with the active response folder. Of course, that would be a way of getting around that that restriction of not enabling the manager to add in arbitrary code. Okay, so the way that it works, let's go back into this diagram. The way that it works is, well, first there's an event. An event can come from an agent, it can come from any other place, but it gets sent over into the analysis engine right in the manager, right? It gets analyzed, then it matches a rule that is configured to trigger an active response. The manager goes back and tells the agent or agents, you can configure an active response that affects all of the system, a specific set of endpoints, or a specific endpoint, or just the one that generated the event. So let's say it goes back and says that. And so it provides the response, it tells the agent to go ahead and do a response. You must remember always that the communications, in this case, agent B, communicates downward or communicates to the remote B, initiates all communications. And so the manager is just going to sort of reply with active response, right? And when it does so, well, the executive, exec D or executing daemon is going to run the script that you have, or the executable that you have on that machine, which will take an action, usually by working with the system tools that are in there. So for example, if you're blocking IP, it will work with the IP tables. And it will also be in charge of maintaining the active response log. Okay, so if it is good idea to always, you know, have proper logging. In this case, active response, the active response log is populated by the script itself. If execd does not manage to run AR script or receives an error when running it, that will be logged in the OSSEC.log. But in any case, the normal way to go is then IP tables goes back, logs that, log collector, again, also sends it into the agent, agent D service, which sends the log over into the manager, and that gets also logged by itself. It is also important to note that it has the capability to undo actions or to take a secondary action. So in the case of IPs, of IP blocking, you can set it so that it, after a given time, unblocks. It sends another action into the IP tables command so that it will stop blocking the originally blocked IP. Okay, so an active response, as I've been mentioning, will run in response to an event having been triggered an alert. That alert can be, a specific ID, or having a threshold, having met a threshold. So for example, you can set it so that it sends out a message whenever there is a level 12 or above alert, or you can set it to be by groups, right? You can set it so that every time there is an event of the syscheck module, it will run a scan on those new files. Okay. Is there a way to, okay, so first, Thomas, is there a way to manually invoke a block or unblock command? Yes, you can use the API to run actions on demand, okay? And then in the auto remediation case, timer configured, can we press a button to release the rule? So it's the same question in a way, so you can set it to go ahead and run the action on demand. You can go ahead in the API, and let's actually show that endpoint. I'm not going to run it right now since I don't have it configured. But if we go here into the API console and say, let's give it a little bit of space, say put, and then active response, you'll see that you have the capability of sending an active response to a specific agent. And then within the parameters, you can specify, well, which agent, which active response, and what time to take before undoing the action. With all of the endpoints of the API, you can click here to go directly to the documentation of that endpoint. So here I'm going to be looking to the put active response. once this finishes loading, this part of the documentation is automatically generated from the code. And so here it's going to tell me, this is what you normally put in the payload. So I should include, well, arguments if I have any, and then what's the command, if whether or not it's a custom command, and then the actual alert information. And that's actually something very interesting. In Wazuh 3.x, the active response module was a lot simpler. It was only able to take one of three different arguments. It would be, file name, username, and IP, right? And so that would greatly limit what the capabilities of it were. Now, what it does instead is it passes along to the agent, to the script, the full alert that triggered that rule that in turn triggered the active response. So you pass along all of that information, and the agent the script or the executable is in charge of understanding what you want to grab from there, okay? It gives you a lot more power over what actions can be taken, but it also adds in a bit of complexity. Since this must be done by listening in via the standard input, no, not via the arguments in the executable, but the standard input, and it does so in a JSON format. So you must be able to handle that JSON format in some way. So it used to be that most active responses were simple shell scripts or bash scripts or CMD scripts in the case of Windows. Now they are almost all the time compiled versions written in C or well, in Python you can have them, but then you would have an interpreter, on the agent, okay? So yeah, that's very interesting. You will have that ability to add in that payload, including the information coming from the alert, and then push that from on demand. But ideally, it is meant as it is built to be a mechanism to automatically respond against something, and you'll see that it is very fast, even though it does have to go do this back and forth, generate the event, and then the event comes back into the agent. But you'll see that the blocking is almost instantaneous thanks to the way that the agent manager communication works. Okay, so then you do have to configure a couple of parts to the tool. First, what's the criteria that when do you want to run this? So that would be this. Then which command do you want to run, and where do you want to run it, right? So a way to view to have a view of everything that was blocked via AR, then remediate them. So that would be something that you would need to be in charge of if you're doing custom scripts, right? The default is, yes, the alerts should have should run in sort of a similar format to what we have built. The default active responses do have their own they have their own group. So if we look for active response, probably not back to that. Let's look for the word active. You'll see that we have logs specifically for active response messages, right? And so you would be able to search for this group of alerts, active_response, and see all of them and see if you need to take any other action, right? To undo or investigate any further, right? But then, of course, if you are going to be adding your own, this is something that a lot of people will do. You need to make sure to write logs so that they are, they trigger these rules or your own rules to properly log them, and then search for them. I often get asked, and it is something that it also is coming in the future version, is a specific dashboard for incident response. Okay. So in that case, currently you would have to go to security events to see it. In here, yeah, and just search for active_response. There will be automatic agent restarts shown here sometimes, but yeah, no other active response is configured by default. Okay, so finally, once we have the location, the amount of time, if you have an undo action or a timeout allowed, that is what you need to configure. as an active response. However, the command itself has its own configuration. So it will be set on two parts. The default commands that we have, you will find that they are already included in the manager's configuration, but not the active response. So just the commands that are associated to them. And just as an example, here we have, firewall, a command to block IPs using IP tables for Linux, several flavors of Linux like Solaris, FreeBSD, and AIX. And then firewall ddrop for Red Hat and CentOS. And then, SH for Windows. Disable account in the case of Linux allows you to block people from logging in by disabling their password. It is important to note that this is not disabling the account in general. If they are already inside, they can continue to use their instance. You may want to kick them out otherwise. But yeah, this will disable their password. And then another one to send out messages, although we'll see later on with the integrator that there is an easier way to send out messages. And for example, an on-demand scan with Kaspersky or Jara or anything else that you may want to add. The Jara one is not included by default, but you can, we do have there on the documentation how to add it. And so of course you can build your own, right? Okay, uses for active response. It can be mostly, it's mostly used so that you can take a quick action to reduce the impact that an event, an adversary may have on your environment. So you can use it to block attacking IPs, restore a backup, do things like that. Or you can also use it to do custom alerting or, send out messages locally, or even take maintenance actions, right? You can go ahead and use it to every now and then run, an update on a machine. I've seen people use this, although it's interesting that whenever they would get a critical level vulnerability on one of their packages, to try and automatically run an active response to update the package immediately, right? And so that was interesting. Of course, updating packages on production can lead to unexpected behavior, sadly. So yeah, it would be ideal if we could leave automatic updates on. Okay, so as I mentioned, you do have to specify how the command is going to be run. Spaces is basically where you give it a name. You specify what's the name of the executable inside of the active response bin folder. And yeah, I love it. And then whether or not that script is expected to have a timeout, right? This way, you can then specify in the next part of the configuration, the active response part of the configuration, well, whether or not it has a timeout, when it will have that timeout. Then what is the rules that it should match, or the matching criteria. Here we can add rule groups or rule level, and then where it's going to be run. And as I mentioned, this, when we say local, that means on the agent that generated the alert, but you can also have it be run on absolutely all of the endpoints, or on a specific endpoint, like the server, like the manager, sorry, is called the server here, or another instance. For example, if you have a machine that is your Active Directory domain controller, you can have it run and a response on that machine to disable an account on all the machines, and you don't have to run it locally on all at once, even if the event was observed on a different machine. Or the same goes for firewall. If you happen to have a firewall where you can run actions and have the Wazuh agent installed, you can, in theory, also have that be the special one to handle the firewall. Or you can set it to all, and that will run it on all agents, not on the server. If you want to add it on both the agents and the server, sorry, not on the managers. If you want to add it on both, then you can add multiple instances of active response. Okay, having said all of that, we can go ahead and block IPs on our Linux machine by doing the brute force. Let's repeat the brute force, but let's now get blocked. Any questions? I'll step away a couple of seconds. I want to let you get started on that and be right back.